battle-scarred alien goes rigid after learning what humans survived in battle. Part 2. The Record Room. The next morning, Vrethkal arrived at the human archive room exactly on time. He had not slept well. The bed was too soft, the air too warm, and the silence of the station irritated him. On Draven warships, there was always noise, the hum of engines, the clatter of weapons being maintained, the low growling conversations of soldiers who never fully relaxed. Here, everything was calm and quiet, and it made his scales itch. Nate was already there, standing beside a long table with a data terminal built into its surface. Lisa sat at the far end, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The room itself was plain. Gray walls, soft overhead lighting, a row of display screens along one side. Nothing about it suggested it contained anything remarkable. Vrethkal sat down heavily. The chair groaned under his weight. Yashri took her place, standing behind him, as was her custom. "Let us begin," Vrethkal said. "The compact assessment requires a full accounting of your species' military history. I want to know what you have fought, what you have survived, and what you have lost." He said it the way he had said it to a dozen other species before. It was routine, a formality. Most younger species had short, modest records. A border skirmish here, a civil conflict there. Nothing that would take more than an hour to review. Nate nodded and activated the terminal. A soft blue light filled the surface of the table. "I should tell you up front, Commander, that our military history is long. Humans have been fighting wars for thousands of years, long before we ever reached space. I will try to focus on the events most relevant to the compact's criteria." Vrethkal waved a claw. "Start wherever you like. I doubt it will take long." He simply pulled up the first set of records and began. About 110 years before humans achieved faster-than-light travel, our species fought a global conflict we call the First World War. It involved dozens of nations across our home planet and killed roughly 20 million people. Vrethkal blinked. That was a larger number than he expected. But he said nothing and let Nate continue. Nate described the trenches, long, narrow ditches carved into the earth, where soldiers lived for months and sometimes years at a time. He explained that these trenches stretched for hundreds of miles across entire continents. The soldiers inside them slept in mud. They ate cold food out of metal cans. Rats the size of small animals crawled over them at night. Disease spread through the lines constantly, killing men just as surely as enemy fire. Then Nate told him about the gas. Both sides developed chemical weapons, he said, keeping his voice steady and even. Chlorine gas, phosgene, mustard gas. These chemicals burned the lungs, blistered the skin, and blinded soldiers who could not get their protective masks on in time. Mustard gas was the worst. It did not kill quickly. It burned the body slowly, inside and out. Men who breathed it often took days to die, drowning in the fluid that filled their own lungs. Vrethkal's claws curled against the surface of the table. Among the Draven, the use of chemical weapons was considered one of the lowest acts any species could commit. It was grounds for exile, for total exclusion from civilized space. Entire species had been condemned for it. "Your people use these weapons on each other?" he asked. And the soldiers who survived the gas attacks went back to the front lines and kept fighting. Vrethkal stared at him. He did not speak for a long moment. Nate moved on. He brought up the second global conflict, which humans called the Second World War. He explained that it came barely 20 years after the first one ended. "This war killed approximately 60 million people," Nate said. The number hit Vrethkal like a physical blow. 60 million. That was more than the entire population of some species in the compact. He had fought in campaigns that destroyed civilizations. But the numbers Nate was describing came from a single planet. One world, one species killing itself, in numbers that most galactic wars never reached. Nate described the Battle of Stalingrad, a city reduced to rubble, where two massive armies fought for nearly 6 months, in conditions that defied reason. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Soldiers ate rats, leather from their boots, and anything else they could find. They fought room to room, building to building, sometimes floor to floor, within the same shattered structure. Snipers hid in the ruins and waited for days without moving, lying in the cold, with frozen fingers on their triggers. He described the beaches of Normandy. Thousands of young soldiers, loaded into small boats, and sent across a cold, rough sea toward a coastline lined with machine guns, artillery, and fortified bunkers. The first waves of men were cut down almost immediately. The water turned red, the sand was covered with bodies, and still, more boats came. More men jumped into the water and ran toward the guns. Many of these soldiers were not professional warriors, Nate said quietly. They were ordinary people, farmers, teachers, factory workers, students. They were drafted, pulled from their normal lives, and handed weapons. Some had never fired a gun before their training began. And they charged those beaches, knowing most of them would die before they reached the sand. Yashri shifted behind Vrethkal. He could hear the faint click of her claws tightening. Vrethkal sat perfectly still. His yellow eyes had not blinked in over a minute. Lisa leaned forward. "If I may add something, Commander." He gave a slow nod. Lisa spoke about the medical side of these wars. She described battlefield surgeries performed in muddy tents with basic tools, sometimes without any pain relief at all. She described medics, many of them barely adults themselves, who crawled across open ground under heavy fire to reach wounded soldiers and drag them to safety. She talked about field hospitals that ran out of supplies, out of blood, out of bandages, but never stopped operating. Doctors performed amputations by lantern light. Nurses held dying men's hands and told them they were going to be fine, even when everyone in the room knew they were not. The survival rate for serious battlefield injuries in these conflicts was terrible by modern standards, Lisa said. But the effort that went into saving every single life was extraordinary. No one was left to die if there was even the smallest chance of saving them. Vrethkal's jaw tightened. He could feel something building in his chest, a pressure he did not recognize and did not like. It sat between his hearts like a stone. He asked the question before he could stop himself. How old were these soldiers? Nate looked at him steadily. The minimum age for service was usually 18, but many lied about their age to enlist. Some were 16. A few were younger. The room went completely silent. Vrethkal did not move. His scales had gone darker, a stress response his body produced without his permission. These were children, by almost any species standard. Sent into gas, into freezing rubble, into machine gun fire on open beaches. And they went. They went because their world asked them to, and they did not say no. He looked at Nate, then at Lisa, then at the data still glowing softly on the table. He had come into this room expecting to spend an hour reviewing a short and unremarkable military record. He had expected to confirm what he already believed, that humans were too young, too soft, and too inexperienced to belong among the warriors of the Compact. Instead, he sat in his chair with his claws pressed into the table and a heaviness in his chest that he could not name. And they had only shown him 2 wars, 2 conflicts from a species that, according to the records, had fought hundreds. We can stop here for today if you prefer, Commander, Nate offered. His voice was gentle, not weak, the voice of someone who understood what the information was doing and was not going to push. Vrethkal stood, his chair scraped against the floor. He looked at Nate for a long moment, and for the first time since arriving on the station, there was no dismissal in his eyes. there was something else, something he was not ready to name. "Tomorrow," he said. "Show me more tomorrow." He turned and walked out of the room. aHFY followed, her footsteps quick and tight. Neither of them spoke. Nate and Lisa sat in the quiet room for a while after they left. The data terminal still glowed softly on the table between them. Lisa let out a long, slow breath. He was not ready for that. Nate shook his head. No one ever is. Danny let the noise die on its own. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask for silence. He simply stood there at the small table on the floor of the amphitheater, holding the sheet of paper at his side, and waited. It took nearly 5 minutes for the chamber to quiet down, and during those 5 minutes, Cora watched Danny's face and saw nothing on it except patience. He might as well have been waiting for rain to stop. When the room was finally still, Danny began to speak again. He kept his tone conversational, almost friendly, as if he were explaining something over dinner, rather than standing in the heart of an alien empire that had just threatened to enslave his entire species. He told them about the blue dots. 60 years ago, he said, when humanity first became aware of the Zarathi Empire's existence through intercepted long-range communications, Earth's intelligence community made a decision. They understood that humanity was small and young, and that the galaxy was full of old and powerful civilizations that might not welcome a new neighbor. They could not build a fleet large enough to compete. They did not have the resources or the time. So they chose a different path. They began sending things into the Empire. Not ships, not soldiers, small things, quiet things, autonomous relay stations no bigger than a human fist, designed to drift through space and attach themselves to existing infrastructure. Sleeper drones that could lie dormant for decades inside asteroid fields and orbital debris clouds. Software packages woven so deeply into Zarathi communication networks that they had become part of the system architecture. Invisible and patient. And most importantly, gravitational pulse devices. Danny paused here and let the translation systems catch up. He could see the effect his words were having. The Zarathi delegates on the War Council had gone very still. Several species in the upper tiers were leaning forward, their sensory organs locked on the projected map. The Morweni trade delegation, a group of slender, silver-skinned beings, known as the Empire's primary merchants, were whispering urgently among themselves. Danny explained what the gravitational pulse devices were. They were not bombs. They were not weapons of mass destruction in the traditional sense. Each one was a compact piece of engineering, about the size of a human cargo container, embedded deep within the orbital infrastructure of a planet, inside a space elevator's counterweight, beneath the foundation of a ring station's docking assembly, woven into the structural supports of a moon-based transit hub. When activated, each device could generate a precisely calibrated gravitational disturbance, not strong enough to shatter a planet or collapse a moon, but strong enough to destabilize the mechanical systems that civilizations depended on to survive. A space elevator with a destabilized counterweight would tear itself apart within hours. A ring station with a shifted gravitational center would begin to drift out of orbit. A transit hub built on a moon whose orbit had been nudged by even a fraction of a degree would lose its alignment with every shipping lane it served. Danny told them that these devices had been placed on over 400 Zarathi worlds. He told them that 11 of the Empire's 14 capital systems were included in that number. He told them that every device was connected to a relay network that could receive a single activation signal from Earth, and that if that signal was sent, all 400 devices would activate simultaneously. He was not describing an attack. He was describing the end of logistics. The Zarathi Empire, like every large civilization in history, ran on supply chains. Food, fuel, raw materials, manufactured goods, information, all of it moved along carefully maintained routes between carefully maintained stations, If those stations failed, the routes collapsed. If the routes collapsed, worlds that depended on imported food would begin to starve within weeks. Worlds that depended on imported fuel would go dark. Medical supplies, construction materials, military provisions, all of it would stop, not because it had been destroyed, but because the infrastructure that moved it no longer worked. Danny did not say this with any satisfaction. He said it the way a doctor might describe a diagnosis, clearly and without emotion, because the facts were serious enough on their own. The amphitheater was silent now, truly silent, in a way that a room full of 900 species should not have been able to achieve. Cora could hear her own heartbeat. Vorath spoke. His voice was lower now, stripped of the theatrical authority he had used earlier. He asked Danny how humanity expected the Empire to verify these claims. It could be a bluff, a desperate lie from a desperate species. Danny nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable question. He told Vorath that he had deliberately included the coordinates of certain devices on the map, enough for the Zorathi to send search teams and confirm their existence. He suggested they start with the device embedded in the counterweight of the space elevator on Korriban itself, the very station they were standing on. He gave them the exact location, down to the maintenance shaft and access panel number. Vorath sent a team immediately. The chamber waited. Cora felt sweat running down her back. Danny sat down, opened his briefcase again, and took out a small thermos of coffee. He poured himself a cup and drank it while 900 species watched him in stunned silence. 20 minutes later, the search team reported back. They had found it, a compact device of human manufacture, seamlessly integrated into the station's counterweight assembly, active and connected to an external relay network. It had been there for at least 30 years. The chamber did not erupt this time. The silence deepened. It became heavier. Cora saw something change in the posture of the alien delegations around the room, a shift from disbelief to understanding. The Morweni delegation had stopped whispering. The Selthari scientists, pale blue beings with enormous dark eyes, were staring at Danny with an expression that Cora could only describe as respect. Danny finished his coffee, folded the paper, and placed it back in his briefcase. He looked up at Vorath and spoke one more time. He said that humanity had no interest in war. Humanity was young and busy and had a lot of growing left to do. They did not want to conquer anyone, or rule anyone, or prove anything to anyone. But they also had no interest in surrender. What they wanted, he said, was very simple. They wanted a conversation between equals. He closed his briefcase, set his hands on the table, and waited for Vorath's answer. The High Commander stared down at him for a long time. Then, for the first time in recorded Imperial history, the Zorathi Empire asked a lesser species for a recess. The recess lasted 3 days. During those 3 days, the Zorathi Empire moved faster than it had moved in centuries. Vorath dispatched search fleets to dozens of the coordinates Danny had revealed on the map. Military teams tore into space elevators, ring stations, orbital platforms, and transit hubs across 11 star systems. They found the devices exactly where Danny said they would be. Every single one. Compact, elegant, humming with quiet energy, wired into the bones of infrastructure that the Zorathi had believed was untouchable. Some of the devices had been in place for over 40 years. They had survived routine maintenance inspections, system upgrades, and full structural overhauls without being detected. The engineering was so clean that several Zorathi technicians reportedly stood in silence for long minutes after uncovering them, not out of fear, but out of professional admiration. But the real blow was not what they found. It was what Danny had implied but never said directly. The map showed only a fraction of what existed. Danny had revealed the coordinates of perhaps 80 devices. He had claimed there were over 400, and if the Zirathi could not detect the ones that had been sitting inside their own stations for decades, they had no way of knowing how many more were hidden in places the map did not show. The number could be 400. It could be 4,000. There was no way to know, and that uncertainty was worse than any confirmed threat. On Koruvan, the political atmosphere shifted like weather before a storm. The grand amphitheater remained closed, but the corridors and meeting halls of the station buzzed with activity. Species that had sat quietly through the initial declaration were now talking, and not all of them were talking to the Zirathi. The first delegation to approach Danny was the Morweni. They were the Empire's merchant class, a species of tall, silver-skinned beings who controlled roughly 40% of all trade within Zirathi space. They had joined the Empire voluntarily 8,000 years ago in exchange for commercial privileges, and they had prospered enormously under that arrangement. But they had also chafed. The Zirathi taxed them heavily, restricted their trade routes, and treated them as useful but subordinate. The Morweni smiled and complied, and quietly resented every moment of it. A Morweni trade envoy named Kale Suvani requested a private meeting with Danny. Cora accompanied him to a small conference room on the station's diplomatic level, where Kale was waiting with 2 aides. Kale was elegant and direct. He told Danny that the Morweni had been watching the situation carefully, and that they were impressed. He wanted to know what humanity actually wanted. Danny poured himself a cup of the station's tea, which was thick and purple, and tasted, according to Cora's later description, like warm seawater mixed with licorice. He drank it without complaint, and then told Kale the truth. Humanity did not want to rule anyone, he said. They did not want territory inside the Empire. They did not want tribute or special status. What they wanted was to be left alone to grow and trade and make their own mistakes. And they wanted the freedom to do business with anyone who was willing, including the Morweni. Kale considered this. Then he asked the harder question. What would humanity do if the Empire attacked anyway? Danny set down his cup. He said that if the Zirathi chose violence, humanity would activate every device it had placed across the Empire. Not to kill, not to destroy worlds, but to collapse the supply chains that held 900 species together. He said that within 6 weeks of activation, over 100 Zirathi worlds would face critical shortages of food, fuel, and medical supplies. Within 3 months, the economic damage would be so severe that the Empire's ability to wage war would be functionally gone. Not because its fleets had been destroyed, but because there would be nothing left to fuel them with and no infrastructure left to coordinate them through. He said this calmly, without pride or threat, and then added something that Cora would remember for the rest of her life. He said that humanity had learned a long time ago, through centuries of its own painful history, that the best way to prevent a war was to make the cost of starting one so high that no rational mind would choose it. He said he hoped the Zirathi were rational. Kale left the meeting and spoke with the Selthari delegation the same evening. The Selthari were the Empire's scientists, a species of quiet, blue-skinned beings with vast dark eyes who maintained the technological infrastructure that kept the Empire running. Without the Selthari, the Zirathi could not repair their own communication networks or maintain their faster-than-light drives. Like the Morweni, the Selthari had joined the Empire voluntarily, and like the Morweni, they had grown tired of being treated as servants rather than partners. Within 2 days, the Morweni and the Selthari jointly issued a formal statement to the Imperial War Council. They demanded a diplomatic resolution to the human situation. They said that military action against Earth would be reckless, and that the Empire could not afford the economic disruption that would follow. The statement was polite but firm, and everyone who read it understood what it really meant. If the Zirathi went to war, the Morweni and the Selthari might not follow. 3 other major species, the Vren, the Holadi, and the Tauri Sek, issued similar statements within hours. Vorath was furious. He stormed into the War Council chamber and demanded authorization for an immediate strike against Earth. He argued that the devices could be found and disabled, that human engineering was primitive compared to Zirathai technology, and that allowing a lesser species to dictate terms would destroy the Empire's authority. He spoke with the passion of a commander who had spent his entire life believing in the absolute power of the Empire he served. The War Council voted. The result was 7-5, against military action. It was the first time in over 1,000 years that the Council had denied a High Commander's request for war. Korra asked Danny that evening how he had known this would happen. They were sitting in the small quarters assigned to them on the station's diplomatic level. Danny was drinking coffee from his thermos, the station's supply having finally run out of anything he found drinkable. He told her that he had not known for certain, but he said that every empire he had ever studied, human or alien, was held together not by strength, but by the belief in strength. The Zirathi had ruled for 12,000 years because every species under them believed that resistance was impossible. Once that belief cracked, even slightly, the politics did the rest. The Morweni did not rebel because Danny asked them to. They spoke up because they had been wanting to speak up for centuries, and Danny had given them a reason to believe it was safe. Korra thought about this for a long time. Then she asked him what would have happened if Vorath had attacked anyway, before the politics had time to work. Danny looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, the easy smile was gone. He told her that the activation signal had been live since the moment they left Earth. If the Red Tail was destroyed, or if Danny failed to send a status update every 12 hours, the signal would be sent automatically. He told her that he had been carrying that weight since the day they departed, and that he hoped she understood why he had not mentioned it earlier. Korra understood. She also understood, in that moment, exactly how much courage it had taken for a quiet man from Texas to sit in that chamber, smile, and unfold a piece of paper. The negotiations began on the 4th day after Danny's revelation, and lasted for 6 months. They were not easy. Nothing about them was easy. The Zirathi Empire had never negotiated with a species it had declared subject to conquest. And there was no precedent, no framework, no chapter in their legal code that described how to treat a civilization that had refused to kneel and gotten away with it. Every clause had to be invented from nothing. Every term had to be argued, dissected, rewritten, and argued again. There were days when the talks nearly collapsed entirely, when Vorath's allies on the War Council pushed for suspension of negotiations and a return to military planning. There were nights when Korra sat alone in her quarters and wondered if they were going to die on this station, far from home, surrounded by species that could not decide whether to respect them or destroy them. He arrived at every session on time, dressed simply, carrying his briefcase and his thermos. He spoke in the same calm, measured voice, whether he was addressing a friendly delegate or a hostile commander. He never raised his voice. He never threatened. He never bluffed, or at least, if he did, no one in the room could tell. He treated every species at the table with the same steady respect. And over the weeks and months that followed, something remarkable began to happen. They started to respect him back. The Morweni were the first to shift from cautious observers to active participants. Their trade envoy, Kale Suvani, became a regular presence at the negotiating table, advocating openly for a diplomatic resolution. The Morweni had run the numbers and understood what infrastructure collapse would mean for their merchant fleets. Kale told Korra during a break one afternoon that in 8,000 years of serving the Empire, no one had ever asked the Morweni what they wanted. Danny had asked on his first day. That had meant something. The Selthari followed shortly after. Their lead representative, a softly spoken scientist named Deel Oravi, began attending sessions and offering technical mediation when discussions stalled on logistical details. The Selthari understood systems better than anyone in the Empire, and their presence lent the negotiations a credibility that pure politics could not provide. Deel told Danny during a late-night session that the Selthari had been waiting for a moment like this for a very long time, a moment when the Empire's assumption of invincibility was finally questioned. They did not want the Empire to fall. They wanted it to change. Danny listened. He always listened. It was, Korra realized, his greatest weapon. In a galaxy full of species that had spent thousands of years being told what to do, the simple act of listening was revolutionary. The turning point came in the 4th month. The Imperial Senate, a legislative body that had been largely ceremonial under the War Council's authority, convened a special session to review the negotiations. Public opinion within the Empire was shifting. News of Danny's map had spread far beyond Korrivan, carried by Morwenni traders and Selthari data networks to every corner of Zarathi space. The story had taken on a life of its own. A young species, barely 2 centuries old, had walked into the most powerful empire in the galaxy and told them no. For subject species who had spent millennia under the Zarathi boot, this was not just news, it was hope. The Senate called a vote of no confidence against High Commander Vorath. It was only the second such vote in the Empire's 12,000-year history, and the first had been over 9,000 years ago. The debate lasted 3 days. Vorath defended himself with the ferocity of a commander who had devoted his entire life to the Empire's military doctrine. But the numbers were against him. Too many senators represented species that had quietly sided with the Morwenni and Selthari position. Too many had received messages from their homeworlds asking why the Empire was risking economic collapse over a species that was offering peace. The vote passed. Vorath was removed from command. He left the chamber in silence, his scarred carapace reflecting the light one final time as he walked through the doors. He did not look at Danny as he passed, but Danny watched him go, and Korra saw something in Danny's expression that surprised her. It was not satisfaction, it was sympathy. Danny understood what it felt like to believe in something your whole life and have it taken away. Vorath was replaced by Tribunal Siobhan, a moderate Zarathi statesperson who had spent decades arguing for reform within the Empire's governing structures. Siobhan was smaller than Vorath, with a pale green carapace and a voice that was quiet but carried authority. She met Danny for the first time in a private session the day after her appointment and told him that she had been watching his performance since the beginning. She said she did not like him, but she respected what he had done. Danny told her that was the best foundation for any negotiation. The final agreement, which came to be known as the Korrivan Compact, was signed on the 182nd day of negotiations. It established humanity as a sovereign independent state with full diplomatic standing within the galactic community. The first species in the Empire's history to achieve such status without either joining or being conquered. Trade agreements were signed with the Morwenni. A scientific exchange program was established with the Selthari. 17 other species opened direct diplomatic channels with Earth within the first year. The gravitational pulse devices were not removed. Danny made it clear, politely but firmly, that they would remain in place as a mutual guarantee of good behavior. Siobhan accepted this with a long look that said she understood exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. Danny and Korra boarded the Red Tail on a quiet morning, 6 months and 11 days after they had first arrived at Korrivan. Lieutenant Commander Vicky Shaw welcomed them back aboard with a handshake and a bottle of bourbon that she had been saving for exactly this moment. Danny smiled, drank one glass, and went to his quarters to sleep. The journey home took 11 days. Danny spent most of it reading and drinking coffee, the same as the journey out. Cora spent it writing her report, a document that would eventually be classified at the highest level and stored in a vault beneath the Planetary Council building in Geneva. She struggled with the ending. How do you describe the moment a species went from being prey to being equal? She eventually settled on a simple sentence. She wrote that Danny Hale had walked into the most powerful empire in the galaxy with a piece of paper and walked out with humanity's future. They arrived on Earth to no fanfare. The classified nature of the operation meant that the public knew only that a diplomatic mission had been conducted and that war had been avoided. There were no parades, no speeches, no monuments. Danny preferred it that way. Cora was promoted within the year and appointed as Earth's first permanent ambassador to the Morweni Trade Consortium. She served for 22 years and was instrumental in building the commercial relationships that would eventually make humanity one of the most connected species in the galactic community. She kept a copy of Danny's map on her office wall for the rest of her career. Danny went home. He retired to a small house on a quiet road outside of Fredericksburg, Texas, surrounded by oak trees and open sky. He taught a xenolinguistics course at a local college 2 days a week, and spent the rest of his time reading on his porch. He refused every interview request, every book deal, every invitation to speak. The few people who knew what he had done respected his silence. Only once did a journalist manage to reach him. A young reporter named Lucy Grant tracked him down at a grocery store in town on a Saturday afternoon. She told him she was writing a story about the Koruvan mission, and asked him, right there between the produce aisle and the dairy section, what the secret was. How did you negotiate with an alien empire? Danny put a bag of peaches in his cart and looked at her. He said it was the same as negotiating with anyone. You just had to make sure they understood that you were not afraid and that you had done your homework. He smiled that same easy smile that had once silenced a chamber of 900 species and walked away down the aisle. Lucy watched him go. She did not follow. Some stories, she decided, were better left with the people who lived them. Outside, the Texas sun was warm, and the sky was wide and blue. And somewhere far above it, among the stars that Danny Hale had helped keep free, the galaxy was learning to make room for humanity. The Zarathi Galactic Empire had ruled the Orion arm of the galaxy for 12,000 years. 900 species lived under its authority, and not a single one of them had ever refused its terms. The Empire did not ask, it informed. And when it informed a species that it was time to kneel, that species knelt. That was the way things had always been, and every civilization in the known galaxy accepted this as a kind of natural law, the same way they accepted gravity or the speed of light. So when a small human deep space mining vessel called the Longhorn drifted across the border of Zarathi sovereign space near the Vela Corridor, no one expected what would come next. The ship was old and loud, and its navigation systems were running on outdated star charts. The crew of 14 had no idea they had crossed into restricted territory until a Zarathi patrol cruiser, a warship the size of the small city, dropped out of faster-than-light travel and locked its weapons on them. The crew of the Longhorns surrendered immediately. They were miners, not soldiers. They were detained, questioned, and eventually released with a warning transmitted directly to Earth's Planetary Council. But the damage, if you could call it that, was already done. The Zarathi had been watching humanity for a long time, decades in fact. They had observed this young species pushing outward from its home star, building colonies on rocky moons and barren planets, spreading across the galactic rim with the kind of reckless energy that made older civilizations nervous. High Commander Vorath of the Imperial War Council saw the Longhorn incident as the excuse he had been waiting for. Vorath was old, even by Zarathi standards, a massive insectoid creature with a carapace the color of burnt iron, and compound eyes that had seen 100 species brought to heel. He believed that humanity was growing too fast and too carelessly, and that if the Empire did not act now, it would have to act later when the cost would be higher. He convened the War Council on the imperial capital world of Zethan and presented his case. The council agreed within hours. A formal declaration of subjugation was drafted and transmitted to Earth on every diplomatic frequency available. The terms were simple and absolute. Humanity had 30 standard cycles to surrender unconditionally. All human military forces would be dissolved. All colonies would fall under imperial administration. Human citizens would be assigned labor roles based on what the Empire decided their biology was good for. Resistance would be met with the full power of a fleet that numbered over 6 million warships. The message arrived on Earth on a Tuesday morning. The United Planetary Council convened an emergency session in Geneva within the hour. The chamber was full, and the air was thick with panic. Representatives from every human colony and nation spoke over each other, their voices rising with fear and anger and confusion. Some called for immediate surrender. Others demanded a military response, even though everyone in the room knew that humanity's defense fleet, while capable, was a raindrop compared to the ocean of the Zyrathi Armada. A few simply sat in silence, staring at the translated text of the declaration on their screens, trying to understand how the world had changed so completely in the span of a single morning. It took 4 days for the council to reach a decision. They would send an envoy, not to surrender, and not to threaten, but to negotiate. The problem was finding the right person. They needed someone calm, someone intelligent, someone who could walk into a room full of species that had been conquering civilizations since before humans had discovered fire, and somehow find a way to keep Earth free. The name that came back from the intelligence community surprised almost everyone. Danny Hale, 53 years old, born in a small town in central Texas. A former professor of xenolinguistics at the University of Austin, who had quietly left academia 20 years ago to join a classified division of the Planetary Intelligence Bureau. He had no public profile. He had never given a speech to the council. Most of the representatives had never even heard his name. But the people who had worked with Danny Hale spoke about him in a way that was hard to ignore. They said he was the most patient man they had ever met. They said he could listen to someone talk for an hour and then ask the one question that unraveled everything. They said he had a habit of smiling at moments when most people would be terrified, and that this was not because he was crazy, but because he understood things that other people did not. The council approved his appointment. Danny received the message at his office, a small windowless room buried 3 floors underground in a building that did not officially exist. He read the briefing, closed his laptop, and packed a single leather briefcase. He did not ask for a team of advisors. He did not request military support. He asked for one aide and a fast ship. The aide assigned to him was a young naval officer named Cora Pritchett. She was 31, sharp-eyed, and had spent the last 3 years working in fleet intelligence. She had a reputation for being thorough and unshakable, which was why her commanders had recommended her for the assignment. But when she met Danny at the shuttle dock on the morning of their departure, she did not feel unshakable. She felt afraid. She was about to fly into the heart of an alien empire that wanted to enslave her entire species, accompanied by a man who looked like he was on his way to a fishing trip. Danny shook her hand and told her to bring a good book. Most of diplomacy, he said, was waiting. They boarded the diplomatic frigate Redtail, a sleek and fast vessel built for exactly this kind of mission. The crew of 12 had been hand-picked and briefed on the sensitivity of their assignment. The captain, a steady woman named Lieutenant Commander Vicky Shaw, told Danny that they would reach the Zarathi border station at Korriban in 11 days. Danny thanked her and asked if the ship had decent coffee. It did. For 11 days, Danny read, drank coffee, and occasionally stared out the observation window at the blur of faster-than-light travel. Korra tried to engage him in conversation about strategy several times, but he would only smile and say that they would figure it out when they got there. She found this maddening. She also found, to her surprise, that his calmness was beginning to rub off on her. By the 6th day, she had stopped checking the threat briefings every hour. By the 9th day, she was reading a novel. On the 11th day, the red tail dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Korriban system. Through the observation window, they could see it, a massive ring-shaped station orbiting a dying red star, glowing with the light of 1,000 docking bays. It was the place where the Zarathi Empire conducted all formal proceedings with lesser species. It was where civilizations came to surrender. Danny finished his coffee, straightened his collar, and picked up his briefcase. He looked at Korra and told her it was time to go to work.